Hello. Get your names down. All right. So today we are covering the civil rights movement, which is the struggle to obtain political equality under the law, economic equality of opportunity, and social equality. All right. That's probably not a sufficient definition for this movement, but I apologize. But let's get right into the assignment, if that's okay. All right. So what we have here, which I will post shortly. I just put it together, so I apologize for not having posted it yet. But I'm going to start at the bottom, if that's okay, with section 4. Section 4 is structural history. Okay, so large impersonal forces, namely World War II, brought about the civil rights movement. So when you get into causation, what caused the Civil War, what caused the civil rights movement, etc., there's subjectivity to it, right? Because you have to have an undergirding question, and that question is sometimes dictated by the values, the influences, preoccupations of your own generation as an historian, as far as what questions you even begin to ask. Then there's so much data that you have to select, and then you interpret that data in a certain manner with certain assumptions. And so when it comes to causation, that's fun in history because it's so argumentative. But here I'm trying to sell each one, right? So I say that World War II in particular and these larger forces triggered the civil rights movement. So you have here, right, people of color, as they said, the lexicon of that time, had just fought an allegedly just war against fascism, supposedly to ensure that the sacred beliefs from classical liberalism and the Enlightenment were not infringed by imperialist bullies. So I'm doing my best to infer what I can't see behind our names. The Atlantic Charter, devised by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to proclaim the Allies the proverbial good guys fighting for human individual rights, was strangely juxtaposed by the reality of the U.S. segregating her Black soldiers, throwing her Mexican Americans into harm's way at the Rapido River in Italy, and placing 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants into internment camps. Colors of all stripes, or people of all stripes, as the expression goes. That's a misprint. People of all stripes bled in the war, some even standing out like the Japanese 442nd Regiment, which was highly decorated, with droves of young Black women heading to California's East Bay to help produce America's war machine. Proud of their contributions and sacrifice during this great crusade, they must have been especially disillusioned by more than ample evidence of racial discrimination that was hypocritically still alive and well and not remedied politically or socially. All right. And so the idea is World War II, and supposedly being advertised as a just war. We went over that term, just war doctrine, from the Catholic Church. Here we are supposed to be the good guys fighting for individual rights according to the Atlantic Charter, and we're segregating our soldiers. We don't trust Japanese soldiers to go and fight in the Pacific. Very few did. Most were sent to Europe instead. And most who did go to the Pacific were used for linguistic purposes. And then we put them in internment camps and asked them questions if they'd be willing to fight for the US. And that's how they devised the Japanese American 442nd Regiment, straight out of the internment camps. And what did they do? You know, instead of showing their resentment, they patriotically, you know, showed the country, should have shamed the country in fighting so valiantly in Italy and other places in Europe. And so you have Felix Longoria in Texas. He fought and died in the Philippines, and his Texas town would not bury him in the military cemetery because he was Hispanic. And so, and then as well as that, in the Rapido River, accusations from Texas Hispanic soldiers claiming that they were sent to their deaths at that river deliberately, or at least callously. You have the Zoot Suit riots, and the Zoot Suit riots, right, were upon the time of a famous case called the Sleepy Lagoon case. There was a murder of Felix Diaz, or Jose Diaz, and there were a group of young Mexican Americans who were derisively called pachucos at that time, like gangsters, like cholos, and they were tried, and it came out in time that they were innocent, but they served time in prison. They didn't receive their due process. They were assumed guilty from their very appearance. And then you had a young, quote, Pachuco break the jaw of a Navy cadet man. And the Navy cadet man went back to his colleagues. They found out about it and they wanted revenge. And you had the Zoot Suit riots in LA. So this is going on while we're supposedly fighting for human rights and the dignity of all individuals, of all people during World War II. The Black women going into the East Bay were not allowed into many of the restaurants and the hotels, etc., in Richmond and Oakland, where they were working and producing the war machine with fighter jets and all kinds of war material that they were pushing out in those plants. And so the hypocrisy just became so glaring during World War II that we were not living up to the Atlantic Charter and to the rhetoric of that war. And then what happens in this narrative of structural history is World War II empowers those very people that became disillusioned during World War II by way of an economic upturn and in particular, the GI Bill. With the GI Bill, right, the vets were granted help with home loans to get a mortgage for a home, and they were subsidized in their college education, right, to this day, the GI Bill. And so thus developed a, quote, colored middle class from Black and Latino and Asian American soldiers, veterans, who joined the white collar or middle class. And so that's a whole other experience, and that's a whole other sociological discussion. Is I wish I could recall the experiment, but there was an experiment in which people were in sociology or psychology, in which people were deliberately wronged at an institution, like they didn't get their money back, or something to do with money, and there was some type of injustice. And they wanted to see if there was a pattern or a type of demographic that stood out in demanding justice in that instance, right? And say, no, I'm not leaving. I want to speak with your boss. We're going to figure this out. This is my right, et cetera, versus those in docile fashion who just would take the injustice and leave the institution. And so at any rate, they found in this experiment that the demarcating factor or variable that seemed to separate those who took it in the chin versus those who would not and stood up against it seemed to have been educational level, that there might be something to do with having a collegiate education that enhances your collective and your individual self-esteem, your sense of entitlement, in a good sense, entitlement to your rights as a U.S. citizen, etc. And so that's just something to think about. But that's what seems to be conveyed in this number 4, is that when the people of color developed, when they entered the middle class from the working laboring class by way of owning homes. And remember, in the 1950s, not only gross national product, because of course that soared in the 1920s, but per capita disposable income rose at one time in the 50s in the 30s percent. And that was across the board per capita. And so the average American was living better throughout the 50s than in the previous decade, and was able to buy luxury goods, things that they did not need as far as a necessity, right? A demand, like food and shelter, etc., but stuff much beyond that. And so the 50s were a roaring time. I have a 50s PowerPoint that I intended to post, if I haven't posted that yet, but with some stats on that, and people, Americans, doing fairly well during the 50s, but of course not all. And there remained particularly an underclass of inner city African Americans in a lot of the big cities that flood of economic ascendance didn't help, of course, but others it did. And so thus developed a colored middle class. And with this colored middle class, as the old term states, they were able to get a college education, and that was subsidized. And you look at a lot of the leaders in the civil rights movement, especially the direct action groups that went to the stores, that went to the streets and protested and engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience, etc. A lot of them were literally college students, college professors, people with college degrees. There was a very overwhelming proportion of them. So much so that the conservatives began to label college or university campuses as the seedbed to all of this discontent and this uprising, if you will. And they're in the collegiate education, right? You were supposed to be trained in thinking critically. You're supposed to learn of historical instances of injustice, of exploitation, and of heroic uprisings against such, right? And so they read and learned of these things. And when they asked people like Jose Angel Gutierrez of the Chicano movement in Texas, he amply stated that he just devoured books, and that's what got him. That's what lit his flame, if you will. And then you look at the leaders of SNCC, of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're at the University of Tennessee and Vanderbilt, and coming straight out of the colleges. You look at CORE, Congress on Racial Equality. That organization had a disproportionate number of people from Stanford and from Harvard and Ivy League schools. So at any rate, that's just something to think about. And then also some joined white collar position like lawyers, preachers, university professors, well-to-do entrepreneurs who developed the resources, the connections, the networks to be able to make things happen during the civil rights movement. All right. And then note, I put it at the bottom, note the Cold War also hastened the civil rights movement. This is also part of a structural argument of large forces, named faceless forces that are bigger than any individual, causing events to happen. Okay. The Cold War also hastened the civil rights movement as the US and Soviet Union competitively jockeyed for potential allies in Africa and Asia. The Soviet Union called America out on its treatment of people of color at home. So President Truman, not so coincidentally, desegregated the armed forces shortly thereafter. So that's something to think about as well. So that's where I wanted to start, as the foundation, is that everything in history emanates from a context, from surrounding circumstances, from the situation in which they're living and from which they had come. And you do a disservice when you simply take things out of context. Okay, are there any questions so far? All right. So number one is what I contend is that the white collar organizations that fought for justice and fought for equal rights in the courts, namely, they were this had become really in vogue during the Progressive era. Matter of fact, they were established as organizations, the NAACP for African Americans, LULAC for Latinos. They were established during the Progressive era, like 1900 to 1920. They are roughly the 1890s through the 19 teens. They by the time of the Civil Rights Movement, they had become known as being a little bit old school. They prided themselves on being assimilated into mainstream and popular, some even dominant culture. So that was part of their argument, right? Is that we want rights because we're just as good, we're no different in our manners and our values and our lifestyles than are any other Americans. So they, you know, a lot of them, they listened to, they tried to overcome the equivalent for African Americans of the Sambo image, right? That the African Americans are the happy-go-lucky, ignorant, animal-like creature. That they were just as sophisticated as anybody else, and so they listened to their classical music. They dressed very well. They made good money. They were very articulate in the English language. They were dual language speakers. And they tried to, they operated from the assumption that America would have to change or mend its ways once the courts dictated such, right? And what was their ultimate goal? Their ultimate goal for many of these organizations was integration, to be fully absorbed. When I think of integration, I think of, you know, I tell myself, what is something? Well, what is it not? Integration to me is almost the antithesis of marginalization. Marginalization, you're kicked to the corner, you're ostracized, you're not given the same opportunities as other people, you're not accepted. And integration is just the opposite of that, in my humble opinion. So they wanted to be integrated. And so they put up a valiant fight. But my argument here is it might be a little bit condescending toward them in stating that, you know, almost as if I'm patting them on the head and saying, good job. It was certainly not in vain. You certainly helped inaugurate some small steps, but it was nowhere near enough. You needed people to change popular sentiment, not just change court decisions. Because after all, many court decisions, and remember, this is deliberately argumentative, so feel free to disagree with me. Because my goodness, right? Notice what I don't mention in here is Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education, by anyone's standards, was huge, was instrumental, right, in overturning the segregation of Black and white students at schools in K through 12. And it was just a magnificent case whereby they used psychology and sociology to convince the court that segregating Black kids engenders within them a sense of inferiority that they can perhaps never in the future overcome. And they won on that basis. But other cases, like I put here, Shelley versus Kramer, were very, quote, negligible in their results. It's one thing for a court decision to be made. It's quite another for it to be enforced. And so, like I said, I'm not trying to, even though I'm deliberately being one-sided and I expect you to disagree with me often, it's not even necessarily what I believe. Okay, remember that from the beginning of the semester. It's just something that I have read or come across and I thought was thought-provoking, and I'd like to see what you think about it. But saying, no, well done, no doubt, great intentions, and some progress made, but not enough. All right. And then I go on to praise nonviolent direct action groups like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, MAYO, Mexican American Youth Organization, CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, SCLC with the Southern Preachers and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They were not primarily, they weren't solely a direct action. They were bigger than that, but they endorsed it. They helped organize it. And at key times, they participated with them in it. So I will, therefore, with that caveat, include the SCLC of Martin Luther King's as well. At times, as you may know, SNCC and others challenged King to join them on the street, saying your speeches are great, your letter writing is great, your organizational skills are great, you're gaining good publicity for the movement. Now we need your feet. Come join us. And he did on more than a couple occasions, and virtually was arrested with them each time, and got a lot of publicity for the movement. So at any rate, nonviolent civil disobedience, right? I don't think I have to explain this to you, but just in case, if you're new to it, the idea that if you have you have natural laws that abide by what God or just nature has an effect, as an axiom that you don't question, that just like the laws of gravity and the different laws in outer space and here on Earth and with physics and chemistry and biology, etc., that there are also moral absolute laws, and that civic laws are man-made laws, and sometimes the civic laws are made in conjunction with the higher laws, and sometimes they're not. And when they're not made in conjunction with the higher moral laws, it is your duty, it's your obligation, it's your right to disobey those man-made laws and to start a discussion, to start dialogue, to start a confrontation that will help bring about a change and reverting back to nature's laws. And so at any rate, what the manner by which you do it is you try to use soul force, as Mahatma Gandhi said, is you have to be above reproach. You have to have the utmost integrity to win the respect of your enemies, just as well as of the general public that's watching carefully. And in being above reproach, you can anticipate your defiance of the laws eliciting a very stubborn, regressive, and hostile reaction from the authorities, because the authorities, firmly entrenched, don't want to admit that they are wrong. They don't like anything that smacks of insurrection. And so you are anticipating a possibly violent reaction, but you absorb it, right? You absorb it because the minute you strike back, you lose that moral high ground that's so integral in winning. And so you take it in the chin, so to speak, you turn the other cheek, and then you be sure that the role of the press and publicity does its job, so that people can clearly see that you are on the side of right and that the governing authorities are on the side of wrong in this instance by the manner in which they're reacting and you are not. And so it's almost creating, it's almost involving an acceptance of martyrdom, okay, with Mahatma Gandhi. And then of course they also took from the writings of the Bible and the life of Jesus. And so those were the two protagonists, that models that were followed, were Christ and Gandhi. And so at any rate, you're supposed to elicit the empathy of your surrounding people. The idea is, right, it's undergirded, this philosophy is undergirded by an optimistic view of human nature, that people by and large are just simply tending their own garden from day to day. They're not inherently evil. They don't knowingly acquiesce to evil, or much less approve it if evil is going on by their governing authorities, but that they're simply wrapped up in their own families, their own daily lives, their own jobs, etc. And so that they need a shock. And so the role of the cameras and of television cannot be understated in making this type of argument for nonviolent civil disobedience. I have it on here, but I don't think I have the rights. Since I go onto YouTube, I don't think I have the rights to play it on my video without permission, but I nevertheless attached it here. But when you get a chance, hit this, and I want to warn you, it's pretty sensitive. If so, maybe you won't want to, but look at just the ferocious manner in which they treated these protesters, and see if it does not move you to sympathy, to empathy for their cause. It's very emotionally moving. And so that's exactly what they want, is they want to gain our empathy and they want to gain our indignation. And that comes from theology, right? Indignation is righteous anger, something that you ought to be angry about, some type of injustice or evil. And so that's exactly what they're trying to do. And on this number, I'm making the argument that it worked very well, that it worked effectively. So you see here, right? Let's see here. A 3-hour special on television called The American Revolution of 1963, obviously, in which correspondents like Frank McGee stated that the March on Washington and public reaction to white violence upon peaceful protesters in Birmingham, that's what I have the footage on, is from Birmingham, Alabama, was, quote, creating a revolution. You had NBC state some strong things about a sense of fomenting rebellion, a sense of it bubbling up under the surface. Howard Zinn states that in his book as well, that a lot of it was already bubbling under the surface, and that they could sense that. So at any rate, something to think about. And so notice what I'm doing on number one is I'm still adhering to the same theme of causation as to what really caused the civil rights movement. and largely on number one, right? I'm saying the direct action, nonviolent, civil disobedient protesters did a great job in doing such. Number two is great man and great woman history. This is kind of the other side of the spectrum from structural history, right? That just looks to big forces as the causes of things. This says, no, you take out certain key individuals and you don't have the civil rights movement, or at least it wouldn't have been what it had been had it not been for these key personalities, these larger than life, talented, influential human beings, right? And so I mentioned Irene Morgan and then Rosa Parks in refusing to give up their seats, and how that just dominoed into the Montgomery bus boycott and into a Supreme Court Morgan decision, and took the country by storm. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the myriad of things he did during the movement. Like I said, he was the face of nonviolent civil disobedience, even though he didn't run SNCC, which was the number one organization that utilized it. He pretty much became the face for it. If you want to look on YouTube and video, just look at how articulate he was, how calm, how ideologically consistent he was in being for integration via nonviolent civil disobedience. All right. And so that's something to think about. You also have trailblazers like the four young men at Greensboro, the Greensboro sit-in in North Carolina, who sat at a whites only lunch counter at Woolworths, asking to be served, knowing full well that, all four of them were Black, that they were likely not going to serve them. They poured milkshakes over their heads. They cursed and said every awful thing to them. And by the second day, they had a large group of white supporters supporting them. And so it got a lot of attention and so forth, and they just decided to do this on their own. Bayard Rustin, Jim Farmer, look at these guys and look how influential they were. If you look into all the organizations that they had connections to, all the speeches that they gave, all the resources that they garnered. Of course, their famous freedom rides into the South with Black and white passengers sitting side by side, which was against the rules in the South, obviously, with the whites to sit in the front and the Blacks to sit in the back. You have Jose Angel Gutierrez, his Cristal movement or Crystal City movement. If you're interested in the Chicano movement, there's a great Chicano CNN series, one on the fight in the fields under Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and everything they did to unite farm workers. And so, and then Jose Angel Gutierrez with Mayo, he helped the city of Crystal City, Texas, fight against the established Anglo powers that be. And so they got a lot of publicity there. Sal Castro in the schools in Southern California. Corky Gonzalez with the Mexican-American party known as La Raza Unida Party, and his poem, Yo Soy Joaquin, that wanted to, kind of like Stokely Carmichael, for African Americans, Black is beautiful, right? To decolonize their minds, that they were taught that they were inferior, ugly, that what they did didn't matter, that they belong, in the blue collar part of society, etc. And they stood up and said, no, we don't have to adhere to the Anglo white man's image of us. We'll look at ourselves by our own terms, on our own terms. So those are just a few examples of leaders in the civil rights movement that, take them out of the equation, and things might not have gone the way that they did. Cesar Chavez going door to door, the SNCC and CORE uniting during the Freedom Summer of '64, going door to door to register people of color to vote, and then having fundraisers to pay the money for the poll taxes that they had to pay in order to vote, and then voting in people that would be sympathetic to their cause and to the plight of their demographic, getting people to with Chavez to strike, right, to call the huelga and boycott the grapes, and the Delano Grape Company would not bend, and get publicity from it. There was just a myriad of things of organizational skills and so forth that they exemplified. And that's a Little Rock Nine you see at the bottom, that young lady, when they desegregated the schools, right? She and 8 others had the courage as Black young African Americans to come as the first Black students to the high school. And look at the hateful, hostile environment around her. And even the soldier in the far left is kind of looking on like, yikes, I'd hate to be you right now, instead of being supportive of her, which of course, ultimately they had to be when the president stepped in and ordered that the troops had to protect the Black students on the campus. But what courage for those 9 students to go in that Little Rock, Arkansas high school. Then number 3, this is very argumentative, all right? But look at my note at the bottom. President Lyndon B. Johnson told Congress that the Watts riots could and likely would be a precursor to more racial violence if nothing were done by Congress. So that's my argument here in this short section of number 3, is you had groups that said, you know what, we don't want to sit at the white man's table. He could sit at his own table. We're going to segregate ourselves. We don't want integration. And so the Nation of Islam out of Detroit, Michigan, under Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X was leader of Mosque number 7 in Harlem, New York, and became his spokesperson, right? And my goodness, you want to look at just manly strength and tenacity, quiet, dignified tenacity. Watch videos of Malcolm X. Just very, very difficult not to keep your attention. And then Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers here in Oakland, California, called themselves a paramilitary group, that they were being colonized as they were, as you would by a foreign conquering country, by the United States, in particular its army, as they saw as the police force. They followed police cars with guns. They knew California law and they couldn't have their guns loaded at the time, but nevertheless with guns, following them to make sure that none of their fellow African Americans were mistreated, pulled over and beaten and thrown without reason into jail. They were well versed in California law. They were students, and one of their leaders was an actual instructor or professor at the Merritt College there at the junior college there in or near Oakland. And look at their 10-point plan. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community. We want decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. We want all Black men to be exempt from military service. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. We want freedom for all Black men held in prisons and jails. We want all Black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in a court by a jury of their Black peers from their own communities. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. So they didn't go so far as like the Nation of Islam of actually wanting to leave the continent and have their own homeland back in Africa. But they wanted to be kind of a semi-autonomous state underneath the United States, but yet partially sovereign from the United States. It's very, very interesting. But the point being, right, is that they got in shootouts with police officers. Huey Newton had to go to trial for the shooting of a cop. They actually had famous shootouts with the FBI because the FBI labeled them as a terrorist group. Malcolm X was just famous for, especially after the Stokes case, there was a Carmichael Stokes who, Ray Stokes. I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Stokes was shot and killed by police officers in Southern California when they were opening up the trunk of a car and selling Muslim suits at the end of a late night service. And the cops were suspicious that they were selling guns or something, illegal. And things just dominoed out of control. And a few people were shot, and one, Mr. Stokes, was killed. And he came from Harlem across the country to Los Angeles. Malcolm X did, and made it adamantly clear that African Americans should arm themselves and they should defend themselves against white aggression, even if that white aggression came from someone in a police uniform. And so my point being on this, number 3, right, is that every demographic, every sector of society and of this civil rights movement played its part. And that there was, however controversial these groups are, there was a degree to which this group was necessary in giving a little kick to the pants, a little impetus to our government to grant more rights, in particular to African Americans, or else. So, number 1, right, contended that Americans can and were shamed into demanding change, right, by the student nonviolent disobedient protesters. This one says, some of them, they just saw Black men and women as weaklings, as beggars, and some were not moved by that Birmingham footage. Some even may have perversely enjoyed it. The intensity of such racism I can't fathom, but that there could have been some that were not moved by that, but they may have been moved by this group here. If they can't be shamed, then they must be deterred. They must be prevented from doing further harm by fear of the consequences. Do you guys have any comments on that debate?
No, no, we don't. I don't.
Okay. Well, Ricky, I appreciate that. I got to admit to you, if we were in class, I would push you further, good naturedly, but I'd apply a little bit more pressure on you. But
I
thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic. But like I said, I thought of this one when I read Johnson's biography in particular. And on more than one occasion, he used fear to try to convince his Congress to make some needed changes. He told them, if we don't, guys, a revolution's coming. Look at Watts and look what happened there. Watts is gonna spread everywhere if we don't do something in particular for young Black men in this country. And of course, the stats were awful. Educational attainment, employment percentages, income percentages, etc. So one of the most famous pieces of legislation that culminated, that the civil rights movement culminated into, was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And what I think I'll do is I think that I'm going to cut and paste the actual jargon, the actual language of that law, because I'll just butcher it, probably trying to paraphrase it. But that basically you can't discriminate on the basis of color or creed. And of course, they've added in the 90s disability. And I expect, if they haven't yet already, gender preference and sexuality as well, that into the 64 law, that you cannot discriminate based upon such things. And then it cites a few categories in particular, excuse me, in particularly with housing, public transportation, and it has a list of things. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act was big. The 1965 Voters' Rights Act did away with all the things that the Southern governments were doing to circumvent the Constitution. Because constitutionally, they knew they couldn't say Black people can't vote. But they can give them a literacy test. They can give them poll taxes, etc. So they got around that. They finally shot those down, those circumventing ways of keeping people of color from voting in the 1965 Voting Act. And there was a 65 Origins Act, and that did away with a quota from different countries, where only a certain percentage or number from particular countries could come each year into the country. And it was very discriminatory as far as allowing a lot more to come from Northern and Western Europe than from elsewhere, as you could guess. So they did away with that as well. So are there any questions? Has this helped at all?
Yes, it did.
Okay, thank you, Cody.
I did also have a question.
Yes, please.
It's a little unrelated, but would you be able to post the study guide for the upcoming test 3?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I'll tell you what I'll do. Instead of just taking the time to devise just the terms. I'll go ahead and give you a preview of the test, Cody. I'll put it just as a file for you to open and to look at. But I'll post test 3 for you.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. No, I'm glad you asked. All right, so anybody else? All right, I want to make sure I have everyone. I do. Good, good. All right, you guys. Well, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day and finally post this for you. Sorry, I haven't posted yet. Thank you for the thumbs up. You guys have a good one, okay? Good luck and thank you for attending. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.